We are already on to week 3 of the NFL season. Here are 5 bold fantasy football predictions for the slate ahead. All right, we're starting in Chicago. The Chicago Bears. If there's been one bright spot so far for Chicago, it's been Odunze. I think he has another big week this weekend against the Dallas Cowboys. We'll say he goes for 25 plus fantasy points for what would be the second straight game. He's your wide receiver 4 right now in full PPR leagues. 15.7 fantasy points in week 1, 31.8 last week in that blowout loss to Detroit. Look, the Bears are a mess right now. I'm not debating that, but Odunze has drawn 20 targets in 2 games. He has a 30% team target share right now. That is elite territory. We'll see if that holds up, but even if we see some slight regression, still really happy with that number. Obviously, we're worried about the QB play for the Chicago Bears. I have my doubts personally about Caleb Williams, but at the same time, we're still early in year 2. I think we need to give him the benefit of the doubt, a little bit more time to grow alongside Ben Johnson. Can't really be a whole lot worse than it's been so far. And I thought Caleb wasn't necessarily the primary issue in week 2 against Detroit. The defense for the Bears, that is an issue. And the more that defense struggles, the more they're going to have to lean on Caleb Williams in the passing game to hang around. I think that's absolutely going to be the case this week against the Dallas team that ranks 3rd in the NFL in offensive EPA. Cowboys defense just gave up over 500 yards of offense to the New York Giants, to Russell Wilson and the New York Giants last week, by the way. So there will be opportunities this week for Caleb, for Odunze to take advantage. I think Odunze comes out, has another big week. He's still a top 5 guy, maybe even climbing into the top 3 by the time we're looking ahead to week 4. 25 plus fantasy points for Odunze. All right, bold prediction number 2 this week. We got a lot of backup quarterbacks on the slate. A lot to deal with in that regard. We're going to go over to Washington, and I think Marcus Mariota is going to be starting for Jaden Daniels. We're going to say Marcus Mariota finishes the week as a top 8 fantasy quarterback. So we're cooking with gas here a little bit, but we have QB injuries all over the league, right? Joe Burrow, Jaden Daniels, Justin Fields, JJ McCarthy, all expected to be sidelined. So you do have kind of a plethora of backup quarterbacks to choose from if you're in a tough spot, if you're in a super flex league and you need that second starter. For me, I rank Mariota ahead of Jake Browning, who I have slightly ahead of Carson Wentz. It's always going to be a crapshoot with these guys. But with Mariota, we have a guy who's in year 2 with Washington. He's a veteran. He knows the system. Caught a couple glimpses of him last season for the Commanders. Had 19.6 and 26 fantasy points in his 2 appearances. Only played partially in each of those games, by the way. Came on in relief of Jaden Daniels earlier in the season and then played the second half in week 18. On the ground, he had 11 carries for 34 yards in the first game, 5 for 56 and a touchdown in the second. In that 26 fantasy point game, he only played 30 snaps. Again, only played the second half in a meaningless week 18 game against Dallas. You look at the matchup this week, the Raiders defense hasn't been a total train wreck by any means. I'm still not convinced this is a plus unit by any means, but I think you look at it as an average, maybe an above average matchup for the Commanders. We need to be realistic. Marcus Mariota, at this point in his career, he is not Jaden Daniels. He will never be Jaden Daniels, but I think the Commanders still want to run their offense. We've seen when Mariota's in there, they don't shy away from running the ball. They brought in a backup like him for a reason. So I think he's going to have opportunities on the ground. Hopefully that provides him with a decent floor. But look, a decent floor, that's not what we're aiming for here in bold predictions. We're going to go bold. We're going to say Mariota puts up 20 plus fantasy points, a top 8 quarterback in week 3. Bold prediction number 3, we are heading to the backup quarterback bowl. Jake Browning going up against Carson Wentz for the Minnesota Vikings. But, lost in all of the JJ McCarthy hullabaloo, for lack of a better term, this week. It's the fact that Aaron Jones is not only out for week 3, he's going on IR. He's going to miss the next month for the Minnesota Vikings. Jordan Mason, he steps in as your clear starter. I think he goes for over 100 yards on this Bengals defense this week. Love the opportunity for Jordan Mason. He was a big target of mine, my most owned running back across all my redraft leagues this season. Part of it is I like Mason, the player. I think Minnesota seeked him out for a reason to be the number 2 alongside Aaron Jones. But I think as this season goes along, we were going to learn that this was going to be closer to a 50-50 split. We already saw plenty of Jordan Mason in these first 2 games. And look, part of the reason I targeted him was I didn't think Aaron Jones would be able to stay healthy. So here we are. Aaron Jones out of the picture. You've got a Cincinnati team that's given up 29.4 fantasy points per game to running backs so far this season. Obviously a very small sample, but at the same time, we saw Dylan Sampson, we saw Travis Etienne get loose on this defense through the first 2 weeks. Cincinnati specifically has given up over 100 receiving yards to the running back position. You don't think of Jordan Mason necessarily as a pass catcher, but he has 3 receptions so far in these first 2 games. Minnesota's offense obviously has been very limited in those 2. I think you get a slight bump up in the short term, just in terms of competency with Carson Wentz taking over. I think we see some checkdowns to Jordan Mason, but really this is about the rushing production. I don't trust that Cincinnati defense. I think Jordan Mason goes for north of 100 yards this week. All right, we got 2 more bold predictions for you, and we are sticking with the running back position for both of these. Bold prediction number 4, Jahmyr Gibbs puts up 30-plus fantasy points this week in a shootout against the Baltimore Ravens on Monday night. Look, the Detroit Lions, an ultimate get-right game in week 2 against Chicago. The running game still not looking quite as dominant as it was last season. We have some questions about the offensive line, but I like this matchup against Baltimore. The Ravens, maybe they're a Super Bowl favorite, but this is a defense that has had some letdowns already this season. They're allowing the most receiving production to the running back position on the year. I think we see Gibbs more involved as a pass catcher, closer to what he was in week 1 against Green Bay. You think back to that crazy week 1 game between the Bills and the Ravens. James Cook got loose for 5 catches, 58 yards in that one in week 1. Baltimore gave up 40 points. They gave up a ton of yards to Buffalo in that game. Ravens, they beat down the Browns in week 2. They were still outgained by Cleveland. Quinshon Judkins was getting 6.1 yards per carry. Ford, Sampson, Judkins combined for 11 receptions as a trio. I think this game looks a lot more like Baltimore-Buffalo in week 1. Totals up at 52.5, easily the highest of the week. I think we see yards. I think we see points on both sides. Jahmyr Gibbs, 30-plus fantasy points on Monday night for what would be the 3rd time in his NFL career. Last but not least, we have our 5th bold prediction of the week. We're going big with another star running back. Bijan Robinson puts up 200 yards from scrimmage on the Carolina Panthers. So you look at what we've got so far from Bijan, kind of a weird game in week 1. The volume was there. He had the long receiving touchdown early in the game, but didn't have a rush that went for longer than 6 yards. Looked a lot better in week 2. The volume was still there. Algier, Bijan Robinson combined for almost 40 carries. Still fell short of his week 1 fantasy production because he didn't get the touchdown. It was Algier who ran it in late in the game. But either way, if you invested in Bijan Robinson with a top 3 pick, I think you're absolutely fine with how things have gone so far. So we look at this matchup this week. Falcons get the Carolina Panthers. Yes, it's on the road. Yes, the Falcons have struggled in these spots under Raheem Morris, but it's the Carolina Panthers. It's still the worst defense in the NFL in my eyes. We saw the Panthers let Travis Etienne get loose for a big game in week 1. Surprisingly, they were able to hold down James Conner last week, but I think that might be more of a Cardinals issue than a Panthers issue. And Bijan Robinson, at the end of the day, is significantly more talented than James Conner. I think Atlanta will make a point to get him involved early, as they have through these first 2 games. So I think he gets loose. I think he gets involved in the passing game, as he always is. Bijan Robinson has a massive day, 200 yards from scrimmage for the first time in his NFL career. Look, we saw Jonathan Taylor do this last week against the Broncos of all teams. Derrick Henry, Alvin Kamara, Saquon Barkley all got there last season. The closest Robinson has ever come, if you're curious, by the way, was week 18 of last season. 173 yards from scrimmage against the Carolina Panthers. He gets it done this week, 200-plus yards from scrimmage.